Constraints really are a creative challenge. They push us to explore boundaries and think outside the box. So, you know how I said before, we're often told to think outside the box. We usually think that it's more that divergent thinking, which we'll talk about. But really, thinking outside the box often happens when we put a little bit of a box around it. You almost have to put the box to think outside of it.
Welcome to Everyday Innovation, your go-to podcast for enhancing your creative and entrepreneurial process. I'm Jordan DeVeccia, a multi-passionate creator entrepreneur, venture studio co-founder, and business designer and advisor. Here we live at the intersection of creativity, strategy, and personal development. Join me for inspiring conversations, actionable practices, and insight infusions designed to shift your mindset and empower you with tools and resources to create impactful ventures. Get ready to take your ideas to the next level and innovate with purpose.
This is one of those subjects that feels kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually quite magical when you incorporate it in your process. Creative constraints. As creative entrepreneurs and early stage founders, we're often told to unleash our potential and think outside of the box, but sometimes that freedom can lead to inaction, analysis paralysis, and constraints can actually help us narrow our focus, redefine and refine our ideas, and then also create more innovation within those set boundaries. A very obvious one that I always think of is if you're an entrepreneur, you're already used to solving a very specific problem, probably for an ideal client. And those are constraints in and of themselves. Like a problem itself has the shape of the context that it's in, and also just that specific problem leads you to come up with a lot of creative and unique, very specific solutions. And then when you're focusing on an ideal client profile, there are those tastes and those needs and their experience that you take into account that puts constraints on your creative process and actually leads to probably more innovative ideas. So that's just a really simple example of something. So just know that probably if you're an entrepreneur, you've already done a lot of this type of thinking. Even as I sit to record this now, there are a few constraints that I put on this. I have a list of points, which I'm sure if you're watching the video of this, you'll see me reference here and there just because I want to make sure I hit all of them and provide the value that I think that this subject deserves. But also I didn't want to over prepare in the sense of, sitting and reading off of a script or sounding like I've rehearsed it too much, because sometimes there's sparks of inspiration that come in while you're recording. And that's what I think the beauty of interviews is you get that back and forth. With the solos, I'm feeling this out a little bit, so forgive me as I probably innovate in this space over time. But I still want it to feel conversational. I want there to be an element of a little bit of that spontaneity so that I just feel like you're on the other side, hopefully listening and taking some of this in and responding in your own way in your mind, right? And it's the kind of that thought conversation. So I'm glad that I've done that. Being on video is a constraint in and of itself. A lot of people feel that, and I understand it, why video can be intimidating. And the reason why I also wanted to be on video is I would be so tempted to just read from something. And I know that y'all listen to lots of audio podcasts and you maybe just be listening to the audio of this now, but I wanted to give the experience of being with someone. And I feel that being on video for me personally allows me to sit with you and talk to you as if we're having a chat, right? When I'm on only audio, I think there's that temptation again to just read from a script or to just read from my notes and not feel that I need to make that eye contact and try to share my thoughts with you in a more unfiltered way. So I hope that you can see where maybe these constraints can be, challenges, but they can also bring out more creativity. And the last thing also that I've done with this as well is I had a really long set of points and scripts and I've just kind of edited throughout, and I probably will edit as I go along as well, because I want to keep it within a certain time constraint, because I just know that sometimes I get overloaded with information and it can be a lot. So especially for a solo episode, I want to make sure that it's a little bit tighter and you get the value you need. So let's talk about the overview of what I'm chatting about in this episode so that you understand the structure. So I want to talk about why constraints boost creativity, types of creative constraints, implementing them in a few different contexts, overcoming resistance to constraints, actionable tips for applying constraints, a little bit on convergent and divergent thinking, and then just wrap it up. So let's get into it. So I want to talk about why constraints boost creativity. So Our brain responds very uniquely to constraints. We thrive under specific challenges. So when we're faced with limitless options, we often experience analysis paralysis or decision paralysis. Constraints help us narrow our focus and basically push us to think more creatively. So for example, designing a product for remote working parents versus everyone gives a clearer direction and leads to more innovative solutions. So there's that ideal client profile that I was referring to beforehand. There's also a food analogy I think that's used often with this, which is if you try to say, okay, think of 5 different foods. Your brain might go, bread. Wait, am I talking about grapes? Should I say broccoli? And you start to kind of stumble over things, especially if you have to say it out loud. That's why sometimes being put on the spot with very broad questions can be overwhelming. But in this example, if you said yellow foods, right? Immediately, banana, lemon, right? If you say foods that are in your refrigerator, you're automatically gonna be like, oh yeah, ham, cheese. You can like kind of visualize where those things are. So having those constraints can lead to maybe more quick insights, right? And they allow you to think more creatively. So maybe if you were thinking of foods off the top of your head, you'd go to your usual 3 things like, bread, cheese, potato, I don't know, whatever that might be. But then when you start to limit it into something more specific, you can say like Asian foods. Oh, you're like, okay, bok choy, tamari. You start to get a little bit more creative with the things that you're doing. And you can use this in certain contexts. It doesn't mean you need to put so many limits on things forever or during the duration of a project or during the duration of even your brainstorm. You can break it down and just pull those things out and put boundaries on it around that particular moment so that you can pull more out of your brain and then over time look at the full picture of everything that you've come up with. Even the Harvard Business Review, in a study that was published in there, said that constraints can enhance creativity by forcing individuals to think outside their usual patterns. So like I said, if you have a usual pattern of coming up with things that are specific maybe to your experience or your specific bias or your industry, by putting some new constraints on it, it might disrupt your pattern recognition there, or maybe activate a different type of pattern recognition. So constraints really are a creative challenge. They push us to explore boundaries and think outside the box. So you know how I said before, we're often told to think outside the box. We usually think that it's more that divergent thinking, which we'll talk about. But really, thinking outside the box often happens when we put a little bit of a box around it. You almost have to put the box to think outside of it. Bigger examples of this, really obvious one is COVID-19. I'm not going to get into necessarily like the innovation around solving, the health challenges of COVID-19, but something just as simple as like outdoor dining setups, right? A lot of restaurants were using their patios in certain ways, but they were just using it as extra seating. But a lot of them, because we now have this constraint of needing to eat outside, okay, well, how can we make this experience better? And a lot of them, their outdoor areas have become way more desirable for their patrons. So now instead of being like, I just want to seat inside in this beautiful area, they might say, hey, you know what? Actually, I want to sit outside and experience this space. It's not just those extra chairs outside or just like a basic patio. They've created an entire experience around it. And they probably wouldn't have done that if there wasn't a restriction on sitting outside, or they wouldn't have used maybe the front area of their establishment to create these outdoor dining areas. And now they're making more money off of it and they're creating a different experience. So that's just one example of something that's a bigger contextual thing that can cause more innovation because of that constraint. There's other things like a few more examples are haikus, right? If you've ever written a haiku, it's the 575 syllable structure. And often that creates a lot of creativity because you have to be so minimal in your delivery and your observations. So a lot of poets will use the haiku structure or something else, a sonnet, right? You utilize that structure to create some type of constraint so that you can get more creative within that space and not go in a million different directions. You have to fit it to the mold of what it is. Songwriting, very similar. If you need to make sure that either things rhyme or that they're in a certain beat structure. So it's really, really interesting to see what kind of creativity comes out and thrives in these spaces. And then another one that I thought of just now, I'm actually reading Talk Like TED. I actually just finished it up, but in the TED structure, they limit to about 18 minutes, which forces speakers to distill these complex ideas into more concise presentations. So a lot of them will use methods like narrowing it down to maybe three main points or three main sections, so they can structure their presentation in a way that it doesn't go over, and it also leverages how people learn in their natural learning state and brain state, which is typically 3 to 7, depending on the size of the concepts. So let's talk about some creative constraints. So there's a few different types. There's time, resources, scope, and collaboration. So I'll get into each one of them quickly. Time constraints, very obvious deadlines, right? Deadlines are classic constraints that can spur action and prioritize focus. So hackathons are a great example of creating prototypes in 24 to 48 hours, maybe a week max, often leading to breakthrough ideas because there is that time pressure. Getting out an essay like the night before it's due was something I definitely would do often and leverage those time constraints, because time for me would lead to more overthinking. So you can use this for your content creation. So let's say you have a strict 5-minute episode limit on YouTube. You can utilize this to refine your ideas and get more creative on how you want to deliver information in those 5 minutes. So the next one would be resource constraints. So limited resources allow us to maximize efficiency and creativity. So talking about startups again, they often start with MVPs, which are using minimal resources to quickly test concepts. So you would be not utilizing too much money, not utilizing maybe too much time to get something out there to see what the reaction is from your audience and your ideal clients. So another resource constraint in the artistic realm would be working within a particular song structure, like I had mentioned. So sonatas have strict structural rules in classical music, but composers like Beethoven were able to leverage having that structure in the music to explore deep emotional and thematic complexity by having a framework that was already there. So the next type of constraint is scope constraints. So a really popular one, obviously, is having a specific niche, because they can enhance creativity by providing a clear direction. So creating, let's say, a health app designed specifically for mental health support for college students can offer more targeted features than just a mental health app, or something for college students' overall wellness, right? And it also really helps with cognitive load and enhances your creative output. So let's say you're a new creator and you're creating within a niche. So it could be like an industry niche, or it could be a certain type of content that you're creating. It just might help your cognitive load when you're creating a bunch of new ideas for content if you already have a predefined area that you're focusing on. And it'll also help your audience as well often. So I know it doesn't always work for everybody and there are exceptions to the rule, but sometimes going with this is a really unique constraint that works really well for people. Then there's collaboration constraints. So a lot of startups, the ones that are the most innovative, tend to be really small teams. It doesn't mean that creativity shouldn't be diverse and really inclusive. It just means that in the beginning, a lot of times creativity can be led into action more quickly when you have a smaller team, or there are many ideas generated by a smaller group, hopefully a diverse group as it is. But then over time, you can continue to innovate, getting a lot of that feedback from your customers and then your future employees as well. So let's talk about implementing constraints in different contexts. So content creation. Themes or specific formats can guide content creation and encourage innovations. On Instagram, if you do a black and white photo challenge, that's going to encourage a certain type of new perspective in your, let's say it was a bunch of photographers did it together, you're going to get some really unique photos because the limit is being in black and white. There are so many different ways that this can be applied to. I love themes in general. I love themed days for productivity. Again, you get really, really creative on what you're doing and how to focus your time when you do have those constraints. So I want to talk about ideation and problem solving in this. There is a really cool method called the Scamper method. So if I'm reading this, I just want to make sure that I get through each piece with their definition. So it's a creative thinking technique that involves different actions to innovate. So Scamper stands for substitute, combine, adapt, modify, put to another use, eliminate, and reverse. So I'm going to talk about each one. You can use the Scamper method in your problem solving or in your ideation. So substitute is replace a component. So for example, chatbots and customer service, you are innovating by replacing a component of your business with something new, right? So or creating something new for companies that want to have better customer service. If you have chatbots that can deliver that, maybe with AI, that's something that might come out of your scamper method. Combine is merging elements. So maybe a fitness tracker with a smartwatch. So there's certain things that already exist, but combining them together, they create even more value. Adapt. So alter an existing idea. So for example, Uber, it's a ride sharing app, obviously, but there's also food delivery. So they're leveraging that existing system and then adding a piece onto it. So you're just adapting it. And then there could be, let's say, another ride sharing service that's not doing as well. If they adapt and innovate into maybe some sort of specialized delivery that's maybe not just food, they can leverage that same sort of technology to do the same thing and leverage that workforce in a new way. Modify, change aspects. So converting a standard bike into an electric bike. You're not really having to reinvent the wheel. Putting to another use. So using a concept differently. So shipping containers as housing. So really interesting model of taking something possibly even for sustainability and putting it to a new use, eliminating, removing parts. So maybe taking away physical buttons on smartphones. You have to be a little bit more innovative in how you design it, but it's something that a lot of people have really enjoyed, not having the physical buttons and just utilizing only a digital screen to have more space. And then reverse. So flip the order. So maybe proactive versus reactive customer service. A lot of times when people have an issue, they'll typically write to the customer service representative, but maybe there is a way to address that by putting surveys ahead of the customer service needs. Or at many hospitals, before anything happens, they typically have a lot of wellness checks and calls before anything. Like you're not calling when things are already wrong. There's somebody already checking up on you ahead of time, right after, just to make sure that they get ahead of any issues. Even just like in personal branding and business strategy, having specific values and guidelines to help you maintain a consistent brand is a way to create constraints. So if company focus on sustainability might only use eco-friendly materials leading to innovative designs. So if that's part of their value system, integrating that into their product and into their messaging even and who they're targeting creates really special constraints that can create more creativity. So the brand example for that also would be Patagonia, right? Their commitment to environmental sustainability shapes its product development and its marketing as well. And then overcoming resistance to constraints. So a lot of people, especially creatives, have a fear of constraints because it feels almost like, I don't know, like it's feeding into a limiting belief or there's something limiting about it. And there's this internal resistance. But they really do actually provide a framework for creativity, as we've been talking about. It's important to challenge your limiting beliefs, but imposing those intentional constraints. So again, intentional, these are things that you're putting in or maybe are given to you by the context of the world. But if you can embrace the creativity of having to work within that, you actually really develop your creative muscle more. So don't fear constraints. Think of it also almost as this sort of flexible structure foundation that you can build upon. That's why I love like business canvases and even certain frameworks for pulling things out because it gives you those prompts already. You don't have to think that up. You can just go through and like a business plan too. It helps you focus on certain areas and then just pull the creativity out of each piece as opposed to just having a mess of things. Yes, it might feel limiting to put it in a certain format, but putting it in that certain format allows things to start to flow and fill the space. So here's some actual tips for applying constraints. Start small. Begin with some manageable constraints and then gradually expand to it. So maybe it is limiting your social media posts to 100 words or tweeting more often. I often find that writing on Threads or X, whatever your preferred method is, anywhere where there's some sort of constraint allows you to get a little bit more creative, not only what you're saying, but how you're saying it as well. There could even be like creating a weekly newsletter only using repurposed content, or like the 3-2-1 from James Clear is a very specific constraint to get certain types of information across. You can even mix and match constraints too. So you might mix some different types to find the best combination. So sometimes it's a time constraint alongside a resource constraint. Let's say a 1 week MVP challenge to develop a basic product with your existing resources. So it's not getting any new resources, and there's also a time constraint. And then you also want to regularly review and adjust. So if types of constraints aren't working for you, or they're feeling like you're not getting more creativity out of it, then just try something different. You might want to do this quarterly, daily, whatever is most appropriate for your process. Just see what's working for you and what's not. Like sometimes having time constraints in certain seasons is really, really empowering because it just gets you to act and move through maybe your creative projects. But then in other seasons, you really need that time to marinate and get inspiration and get those intuitive downloads, whatever that might be. And maybe the time constraint is more limiting. So you really have to utilize your judgment on that. But this is just an idea of how you could apply it. And let's talk quickly about convergent and divergent thinking. So, divergent thinking is expanding your thinking to generate as many ideas as possible. So, brainstorming sessions without any sort of practical limitations can create a lot of diverse solutions. So, if there were no bound, like when we talk about that truly, truly limitless thinking, that's more divergent. So it's sitting there and listing even if it sounds crazy or it's super impractical or sounds impossible, sometimes it is important to have those types of sessions to generate all the ideas out there and then figure out that one of those ideas is actually not so crazy. It's actually perfect. And then it's a great brainstorming exercise too, to just get everything out. And then convergent thinking is really where you narrow ideas down into actual plans. So using like a decision matrix to evaluate and prioritize ideas. So really this method is somewhat convergent, but you're doing divergent thinking within a convergent aspect. So almost like cycling through convergent and divergent thinking to refine your ideas. So it may be you're using the refinement of creating these constraints, but then you're getting as wild as you can within them. So like we were talking about the health app, the mental health app for college students, you may put that constraint on it, but then you're going wild on what kind of features that it would have, what kind of ways that it can be delivered. Is there something totally crazy and off the wall that you could do in person to go along with the app? There's so many different things that you can do, but if you kind of cycle between both and you refine your ideas in a convergent way, so you're saying, okay, we've looked at all the possibilities, but now we're like, based on this university, these are the things that we can and cannot do. You can kind of refine those again. So it's really embracing that cycle of both the divergent, really expansive thinking, and then also the convergent, which is kind of bringing it down to earth and putting some boundaries around it. To recap, constraints can enhance your creativity by providing clear challenges and frameworks. We all need structure in what we're doing. Our brains love it as much as we personally may not like it as creatives. Our brains love a little bit of a framework. So find the framework that allows you to be the most creative. Remember, there's various types of constraints: time, resource, scope, and collaboration that can be applied in different contexts. And embrace the constraints as tools for innovation and structure. So I challenge you to impose one of these constraints in your next project or your content creation, whatever it might be. Please share with me. You can comment on YouTube or on Spotify, or just send me a DM on Instagram at Jordan DeVecchia and let me know what you're working on and how you've leveraged one of these constraints in your project. Please make sure to follow and subscribe. I would love it if you would share and rate this podcast. Let me know what you think. And this feedback really helps grow this and understand who my audience is, who I'm chatting with, and make sure also to subscribe on everydayinnovation.io to the newsletter. You'll get some additional resources, and I also send some things out separately from the podcast. So it's almost like having an extension of this and some other resources to put in your toolbox. So I really appreciate you joining me today. Remember, constraints are not the enemy. They are your